G'day everyone, welcome to week 11 on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. Now, it's not really Bible in a year, of course. We're doing it in 10 months, right? 44 weeks. So unlike many Bible reading plans that challenge people to read the Bible in a year, we're reading a little bit more every week to make sure we get the content done in and basically avoid Christmas, okay? That's the reason for that, avoiding December and January and getting it done in those 44 weeks. But well done for keeping up this far. And honestly, last week and this week, pretty easy readings, pretty good momentum, okay, has kicked back into the story as we've bid a fond farewell to Moses and all the repetition of the law and all the prescriptions of Leviticus and Numbers. I'm pretty glad to have said goodbye to that. And as we kick back into some narrative on what really are a whole bunch of adventure stories, like a bunch of military conquests and campaigns with some of the great and famous heroes of the Old Testament, certainly, okay? And that's certainly true this week as we move from Joshua into the book of Judges. All right, so here we go. Well, last week I explained how Joshua, the book of Joshua, can basically be divided up into three main segments. The first 12 chapters deal with their 7 years of conquest in the Promised Land. The next few chapters deal with Joshua dividing up the land between the Israelite tribes. And these last 5 chapters, the third section that we're dealing with this week, we see a number of things happen. First of all, it talks about a number of cities of refuge for people that commit manslaughter, cities that the Levites are to live in. And also this week we see the farewell, okay, of the 2.5 tribes that decided to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Remember, the fighting men came over. Well, they've left their women and children back home, so they're now going home over the Jordan. We bid a fond farewell to the cousins on the other side of the Jordan. But the main thing really to notice this week is the last 2 chapters of the book of Joshua, where there's basically a 25 to 30 year, not too sure, narrative gap. Okay, when chapter 22, I think it is, starts, or 23, yep, chapter 23 starts, there's a narrative gap of about 25 to 30 years. Joshua, so all the people have had the chance in that time to really settle in their lands, okay? Joshua calls the people to him, and he basically does what Moses did and gives them a farewell speech, okay? His final words, his departing words, it's known as a departure speech. And wouldn't you know it, it's quite similar to Moses. We made mention of that last week, that Joshua's ministry echoes Moses quite a lot, okay? And we're going to see that this week in his farewell speech. Just like Moses, Joshua gathers the nation together just before his death at the ripe old age of 110. Good for him. Just like Moses, he reminds them of their past, how he has led them and how Yahweh has led them, particularly in the last 80 years. Just like Moses, he urges them to follow God, okay, to love him, to obey him, to hold fast for him. He uses all the similar words that Moses used. And please do not commit idolatry. Not a good idea. Don't do it. Just like Moses, he says these are the curses that will come upon you if you do disobey. Red pill, blue pill, that whole thing. Just like Moses. Just like Moses, he prophesies to them. All right, he says, this is what the Lord says. Joshua was a prophet. Okay, among other things, the word of God is in his mouth as he speaks to them. Just like Moses, he presents a covenant agreement to them. Choose for this day, will you serve the Lord? And 3 times, just like Moses, 3 times they say, yes, we will choose the Lord. Just like Moses, he writes things down in the book of the law. And just like Moses, he sets up a memorial as a witness against them, because he knows they will disobey into the future. And whereas Moses' memorial was a song, you remember that, the Song of Moses, Joshua was in the Promised Land, so he puts together a memorial stone as a witness of this renewal of the covenant now that they are settled in the Promised Land. So a lot of similarities there to Moses. However, there is one significant difference that is really important to note as we look at the big story of the Bible and how the journey of God's people goes. Take note of this. Unlike Moses, Joshua does not appoint a successor to his role. Okay? Moses was a national leader. He led all of the tribes. And before his death, God spoke to him and said, I want you to appoint and anoint Joshua to take your role and to succeed in your place. And he does so. Well, Joshua doesn't do that. Joshua does not hear God tell him to appoint a successor. Instead, when he calls the leaders to him, he says, listen guys, you're on your own now, all right? You've got to choose who you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, but you are responsible for your own decisions. Your tribe, your clan, your families, you've got to basically govern yourself from here on in, all right? Now, they still had a national covenant. That didn't change. The law that God gave them at Sinai was still nationally applicable. They still had the same common language, the same calendar, the same shared history. They still had the same prescriptions for worship, okay, of sacrifices, a nationally recognized priesthood. None of that changed, okay? They still had a promised place of worship into the future, although at the moment seems to be Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant and the sanctuary are. None of those things changed, but what did change is that there wasn't one man at the top. There wasn't like a human recognized that gave governance to God's people. And that brings us into the book of Judges, all right? That sets the stage for what happens in the book of Judges, where it lists 12 different leaders. What a coincidence, that number. 12 different leaders between Joshua and Samuel, who we'll get to later on. Joshua and Samuel. It covers a period, Judges, of around about 300 years. There's a bit of debate about that. We're not entirely sure. The accounts in Joshua and in Judges aren't necessarily written in chronological order. Some of their periods that these judges lead overlap one another, and many of the numbers appear not to be supposed to be literal, okay? And you can argue that if you like, but they're very rounded numbers. So they'll say, you know, after this guy was leading, they had peace for 40 years, or 40 years, or 80 years. They seem to very much be rounded numbers, and the number 40 keeps coming up. That could just be a literary device, a throwback to Moses, okay, who led 40 years, or a sign that for a generation they enjoyed peace. It could just be a way of saying that. We don't know. The point is this: Judges covers a period of maybe 300 or so years, and there are 12 leaders in that period. And one thing you are going to notice, one thing that is clear about the book of Judges, is that there is a repeated cycle that is experienced by God's people, where essentially they rebel against God, predictably, they get into trouble, predictably, they cry out to God, thankfully, and God answers their prayer by giving them a deliverer leader to meet that need. Okay? And those men and women are known as the judges, which isn't probably a good word for us, because when you and I think judge, we think a courtroom judge with a funny wig. Okay? That's not what they are at all. They're not courtroom judges. These people are leaders of God's people. And there's 7 common qualities. This is where I want to land today. 7 common qualities of these leaders during this period of Israel's history. The first 2 things I notice is that they are both military and political leaders. So as military leaders, they command the respect of the armies, and they actually gather armies of Israelites together, most of the time from different tribes. They might pull in an army or rally together an army from, 3 of the 12 tribes or 4 of the 12 tribes or whatever. So they're military leaders, and they're also political leaders. They have the respect of the populace, okay? And that's very common in the ancient world. The strong man rules, okay? If you lead the military, you lead the people. That's just how it works. So a military leader and a political leader. They're also anointed leaders and prophetic leaders. Okay, they're anointed. They are divinely appointed. God has chosen these people and commissioned these people to lead for that period of time. So they're anointed leaders, and they're also prophetic. They hear God's voice oftentimes, not all the time, but they hear God's voice, whether it's through angels or the Lord just speaking to them. And then sometimes they prophesy, they speak on God's behalf. They say, this is what the Lord is saying. Now, there's a bit of a warning in that. That doesn't mean that they know God very well. Okay, that doesn't mean that they represent him particularly well. I'll mention a bit about that later, but don't just because they're anointed and they're prophetic, it doesn't mean they necessarily represent God very well. The next 2 things are that they are regional leaders and occasional leaders. All right, they're regional. Most of these guys don't necessarily lead the whole nation, or their influence is not over the whole nation. Okay, they're generally set to a specific region, and they're occasional. They rise up as needed, and once they've done their task, that's it. They don't appoint a successor like Joshua. They don't appoint a successor in their place. Now, you'll notice with Gideon, one of the guys this week, the people want him to appoint a successor. They want his sons to rule them. They basically want a monarchy. We love having a good leader. We love having you, Gideon. Why don't you let your sons in perpetuity always be the leader of us? And he says, nah, no way. God has not said that. Okay. So they're occasional leaders and they're regional leaders. And the last thing to note, the seventh thing, is that they are all unlikely leaders. Okay, you're definitely going to notice that. Gideon was a coward. Deborah, well, she was a woman. Okay, a guy called Shamgar, he wasn't even an Israelite. He was named after a foreign god. We don't even think he was one of God's people at all. Jephthah was a son of a prostitute, ostracized and hated by and rejected by his brothers. Ehud, well, he was left-handed, so that's a little bit strange. And Samson, of course, was just full of shenanigans. And we finish off with his story this week. Many of you know the story of the strong man, Samson. All that to say, they're not necessarily moral leaders, these people. Don't expect righteous character as you read. In fact, there's a lot of R-rated material this week that's been very much, sanitized from our Sunday school stories. You're going to see that. And they don't, like I said before, necessarily know God particularly well. Just because they are used by God, it doesn't mean they particularly know him or represent him well. That's not the kind of leader that the judges were in this period of history, so don't go in expecting that. In fact, if anything, what that shows us, the fact that these were dodgy characters and the Bible highlights that, is it shows us something of the sense of the Bible's credibility. All right. Yes, there is a sense of legend to these stories, rounding up numbers to the number 40, maybe. There's a sense of these are hero tales, but there's also a great sense of honesty. There might be some embellishment with the hero tale thing, but there's also great honesty. These leaders are both effective and they're flawed. Significantly effective and significantly flawed, and it's okay to recognize that. The help that they bring and also the hurt that they bring, because the Bible is an honest book, and you're going to see that this week. All right, but that's probably more of a devotional insight, and I'm not supposed to be giving you that in these tutorials. I'm just supposed to be helping you to see the big story. So here it is, the big picture narrative. The book of Judges is a bridging book, okay, between having national leaders like Moses and Joshua, and national kings, leaders like Saul and David, who we'll get to at the moment. At this point in history, in this bridge in between, there is no consistent national leader. And for the most part, when God's people are left to their own devices, it doesn't go well for them. But God knows this, and when they ask for his help, he provides a man or he provides a woman to bring them back on track. All right, so that is that, guys. Enjoy your readings this week. Closing off Joshua, heading into the book of Judges. My favorite verse, Judges 3:16. You have to read my book to understand what that's about. I've got some reading suggestions below in 6 sittings. Enjoy, guys. You're going to do great, and I'll see you next week for week number 12.